In 1962, Janet Leigh was on the set of The Manchurian Candidate, about to film one of the most famous scenes of her career, when someone handed her an envelope. Inside were divorce papers. She had not asked for them. She had not seen them coming. She was, by every account, blindsided in the most public and humiliating way possible. Her husband, Tony Curtis, the man she had been married to for 11 years, the man she had 2 daughters with, the other half of what the fan magazines had spent a decade calling the most beautiful couple in Hollywood, had filed to end their marriage without warning her first. She found out she was being divorced the way a stranger would have found out, on paper, at work, minutes before she had to walk onto a soundstage and perform. And then she learned why. Tony Curtis had fallen in love with his co-star on a film called Taras Bulba. Her name was Christine Kaufmann. She was 17 years old. Curtis was 37. Janet Leigh was 35, one of the biggest female stars in the world, fresh off Psycho, and she was being left for a teenager. She later said, the thing that broke her was not just the betrayal, it was the humiliation of it. The specific, public shame of being traded, at the height of her fame, for a girl young enough to be her daughter. Here is what almost nobody watching the fairy tale from the outside understood. The marriage had been dying for years before that envelope arrived. Behind the magazine covers and the matching smiles, and the 2 beautiful daughters, Tony Curtis had been carrying on affairs the entire time. Gloria DeHaven, Natalie Wood, others. He was, by the end, addicted to drugs. She was drinking and taking pills to cope. Their younger daughter, who grew up to become one of the most famous actresses in the world, would later say out loud that her parents hated each other, and that she herself had been what she called a save-the-marriage baby, conceived specifically to hold together something that was already broken. That daughter was Jamie Lee Curtis, and the man who blew the whole thing up, who left the most admired woman in Hollywood for a 17-year-old and never seemed to look back, had a reason buried in his past that explains almost everything about how he treated the women in his life. It goes back to a tailor shop in the Bronx, a mother who beat him, a brother he had to identify in a morgue at 12 years old, and a boy who learned before he was 10 that the only person who would ever protect him was himself. Tony Curtis married 6 times. Janet Leigh was the first, and the one everyone remembers, because she was the one who got the version of him that still believed in fairy tales. This is the story of how that marriage really ended, not with the divorce papers. The divorce papers were just the last page. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Before he was Tony Curtis, he was Bernard Schwartz, and Bernard Schwartz spent the first years of his life sleeping in the back of a tailor shop in the Bronx. He was born on June 3, 1925, in Manhattan, the oldest of 3 boys, and the family moved to the Bronx into rooms behind the shop where his father worked. His parents were Hungarian Jewish immigrants who had come to America after the First World War, and they had brought almost nothing with them and built almost nothing after they arrived. His father, Emmanuel, was a tailor who could barely keep the family fed on what the shop brought in. The apartment was 1 back room, divided in half. The parents slept in one corner. Bernard and his 2 younger brothers, Julius and Robert, slept in the other. Hungarian was the only language spoken in that room. Bernard did not learn English until he was 5 or 6 years old, which delayed his schooling and marked him, the moment he walked into a Bronx classroom, as the immigrant kid who talked wrong. The poverty was constant, but the poverty was not the thing that damaged him. The thing that damaged him was his mother. Helen Schwartz suffered from schizophrenia, though it would not be formally diagnosed until years later, and in the meantime what it meant for a small boy was a home ruled by a parent whose moods and violence he could not predict or understand. Curtis said it plainly, as an adult, in language he never softened. When he was a child, his mother beat him. He described her as aggressive and antagonistic. There was no safety in that back room, because the person who was supposed to provide it was the person he most had to protect himself from. The same illness ran through the family. His youngest brother, Robert, would also develop schizophrenia and would eventually be institutionalized. So Bernard grew up in a household with two people whose grip on reality was slipping: a father overwhelmed and exhausted, and a mother whose hands he had learned to watch. When he was 8 years old, the depression bit down hard enough that his parents could not afford to feed all three boys. So Bernard and Julius were placed in a state institution, an orphanage, for a month, not because they were orphans, but because their parents could not keep them alive at home. Two small boys handed over to the state because the tailor shop couldn't make enough to put food on the table. They came back. But a child who has been given away once, even for a month, even out of desperation, learns something about how conditional his place in the world is, and he does not unlearn it. Then came the day that broke whatever was left of Bernard Schwartz's childhood. He was 12 years old. His younger brother Julius, the brother he had been placed in the orphanage with, the brother he had taken it upon himself to look after, because someone had to, was struck and killed by a truck. And Bernard was the one who had to identify the body. 12 years old, standing in a morgue, looking at his dead brother. He kept Julius's cap and his school books for the rest of his life. Decades later, a rich and famous movie star, he still had them, because, as he said, that was all that was left of his brother. Sit with what that childhood builds into a person. A mother who hurt him. A brother slipping into the same illness that made her dangerous. A month given away to the state. A dead brother identified in a morgue at 12. Curtis said, as an adult, that he learned very young that the only person who ever had his back was himself, and that he had to take care of both himself and Julius, because no one else was going to. When Julius died, even that was taken from him. The one person he had been able to protect was gone, and he was alone in the way that a child is never supposed to be alone. He got out the only way poor boys got out in 1943. He joined the Navy at 17, served in the Pacific during the Second World War, aboard a submarine tender, and came home in 1945 to a Bronx that had nothing waiting for him. But the Navy had given him the GI Bill, and the GI Bill paid for acting classes, and acting was the first thing Bernard Schwartz had ever found that let him be someone other than Bernard Schwartz. He was strikingly handsome, with dark wavy hair and pale blue eyes, and a face that the camera would turn out to love without reservation. He studied at the Dramatic Workshop in New York, worked in a Greenwich Village stage production, and was spotted by a Universal Pictures talent scout who signed him to a 7-year contract in 1948. Universal did what Universal did to everyone. They looked at Bernard Schwartz, decided the name was too Jewish and too immigrant and too Bronx for a leading man, and rebuilt him from the outside in. They fixed his look, they coached the accent out of him, and they gave him a new name. Bernard Schwartz became Tony Curtis, and the transformation was so complete that for the rest of his life, the man would carry both people inside him, the manufactured movie star the world adored, and the terrified, abused, abandoned kid from the tailor shop who had never once felt safe. The early roles were small and mostly forgettable, but audiences, particularly young women, responded to the face immediately, and by the early 1950s, Universal understood they had something. The fan mail was enormous. The magazines wanted him. He was becoming, very fast, exactly the kind of star the studio had built him to be. He had escaped the Bronx. He had money and fame and a face on magazine covers. What he did not have, what no acting class or new name could give him, was any working model of what love was supposed to look like, because the only love he had ever known came from a woman who beat him and a brother he had watched die. And then, at a Hollywood publicity party in 1950, he met a 23-year-old actress with a warm smile and a kindness he had never encountered in his life. Her name was Janet Leigh, and Tony Curtis, the boy who had learned that the only person who would ever protect him was himself, was about to fall in love for the first time. Janet Leigh had come up almost the exact opposite way from Tony Curtis, which may be why he could not stop looking at her. She had been discovered in one of those stories that sounds invented but wasn't. A retired actress named Norma Shearer, one of the biggest stars of the 1930s, saw a photograph of Janet on display at the front desk of a California ski lodge where Janet's father worked. Shearer was struck by the girl's face, took the photo to MGM, and Janet Leigh was signed to a studio contract before she had ever taken an acting lesson or appeared on a stage. She was still a teenager. She was, from the very beginning of her career, the kind of naturally luminous screen presence that the camera simply loved, and MGM put her to work immediately in wholesome roles that suited exactly that quality. By 1950, she had already appeared in a string of successful pictures. She was 23, beautiful, warm, and by every account of the people who knew her, genuinely kind, in a way that Hollywood does not typically produce or reward. She and Tony Curtis met at a publicity party that year. He was not yet a real star. He was a good-looking Universal contract player, with a growing fan base, and a lot of small roles behind him. She was more established than he was. And what struck him about her, by his own later account, was not her fame or her beauty, though he noticed both. It was her kindness. He had grown up in a home with no softness in it whatsoever, raised by a mother who beat him, and here was a woman who was simply, uncomplicatedly warm to him. For a man built the way Tony Curtis was built, that was more intoxicating than anything else she could have offered. The courtship was fast and intense. There was a genuine, powerful attraction between them, and they were both young and beautiful and rising, and the momentum of it carried them quickly toward marriage. There was one complication that the fan magazines would later tidy out of the story. Janet had been married before, briefly, twice in fact, in very young first marriages that had not lasted. But by 1951 she was free, and she and Tony married that year. They married on June 4, 1951. He was 26, she was 24. And then the machine took over. Because what Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh had, from the studio's point of view, was not just a marriage, it was a product. Two young, gorgeous, photogenic stars, both on the rise, both under contract, married to each other. The publicity departments understood immediately what they were sitting on. This was the golden age of the fan magazine, when publications like Photoplay and Modern Screen shaped how America understood its stars, and the studios fed those magazines a steady, carefully controlled diet of images and stories. Tony and Janet became the centerpiece of that machine, the perfect couple, the dream marriage, the two beautiful people who had found each other and built a fairy tale. They were photographed constantly, at home, on vacation, gazing at each other. The magazines could not get enough of them, and the public could not get enough of the magazines. For most of the 1950s, if you asked an ordinary American to name Hollywood's ideal couple, the answer was likely to be Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh. They appeared together in 5 films over the course of the decade, starting with Houdini in 1953, which was a hit, and which pushed Curtis from a promising contract player into a genuine leading man. The on-screen pairing reinforced the off-screen fantasy. Audiences watched them fall in love on film and believed they were watching something real, because in the beginning, it had been. Their first daughter, Kelly, was born in 1956. The image was now complete. 2 beautiful movie stars, a beautiful child, a beautiful home, a beautiful marriage, all of it documented in glossy detail for a public that wanted desperately to believe that such perfection was possible. Curtis's career, meanwhile, was exploding. He proved he was more than a pretty face with Sweet Smell of Success in 1957, a dark, brilliant film in which he played a cynical press agent, and then with The Defiant Ones in 1958, in which he was chained to Sidney Poitier as 2 escaped convicts, and which earned Curtis an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. He followed that with Some Like It Hot in 1959, the Billy Wilder comedy opposite Marilyn Monroe and Jack Lemmon that is still regularly named one of the greatest comedies ever made. By the end of the 1950s, Tony Curtis was not just a heartthrob, he was one of the most bankable and respected leading men in Hollywood. From the outside, the fairy tale had everything: fame, money, beauty, talent, a happy home, a beautiful daughter, and the adoration of an entire country. From the inside, It was already coming apart, and it had been for a while. Because the boy from the tailor shop, the one who had never felt safe, the one who had learned that love was conditional and protection was something you provided for yourself because no one else would, had not been made whole by marrying a kind woman. Kindness could not reach the part of him that had been broken in that Bronx back room, and a man who does not believe, at the deepest level, that he deserves to be loved, will eventually go looking for proof that he was right. Tony Curtis started looking almost from the beginning, and the first cracks in the most beautiful marriage in Hollywood were things the public was never, ever allowed to see. The affairs started early, and Janet Leigh knew about them. That is the part the fan magazines never printed and the public never suspected, because the entire machine was built to prevent them from suspecting it. While Photoplay was running spreads about the dream marriage, Tony Curtis was carrying on affairs with other women, and he continued to do so, on and off, throughout the marriage. Two names come up repeatedly in the accounts of that period: the actress Gloria DeHaven and Natalie Wood, who was herself one of the biggest young stars of the era. There were others whose names never made it into print. Curtis was, by every account, including eventually his own, a serial philanderer during the years he was publicly held up as America's most devoted husband. Understanding why requires going back to the tailor shop, because the affairs were not really about the women. A man who grows up believing he is fundamentally unlovable, who learned as a child that the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you, does not experience a loving marriage as a gift. He experiences it as a threat, because it contradicts everything he knows about himself, and the pressure of that contradiction builds until he does something to relieve it. Curtis had spent his whole life certain that the only person who would ever have his back was himself. Janet Leigh's steady, genuine love was, on some level he probably never fully articulated, unbearable to him, because it asked him to believe something about his own worth that the boy in the Bronx had learned was not true. The affairs were, in a sense, him proving to himself that the fairy tale was fake, because a fake fairy tale was something he understood, and a real one was not. He was also, underneath the movie star confidence, staggeringly insecure, and the insecurity expressed itself as jealousy. This is one of the crueler ironies of the marriage. Tony Curtis, who was cheating on his wife regularly, was consumed with suspicion that she was cheating on him. He became particularly fixated on the idea that Janet was having an affair with Frank Sinatra, with whom she was friendly and would later work. There is no solid evidence that Janet ever betrayed him. The suspicion appears to have been almost entirely a projection of his own guilt and his own bottomless insecurity. He did the thing, and then tortured himself and her, with the certainty that she must be doing it too. It is a textbook pattern, and it made the home a miserable place to be. And then there were the drugs. Curtis's drug use, which would eventually become a full addiction that nearly killed his career and did real damage to his body, took hold during these years. The exact timeline is blurry, the way these things always are, but by the late 1950s, the charming, effortless movie star the public adored was, at home, increasingly a man dependent on substances and increasingly difficult to live with. The addiction fed the paranoia, and the paranoia fed the addiction, and the affairs continued underneath all of it, and Janet Leigh was living inside this while smiling for the cameras and being told by the entire apparatus of Hollywood that she was the luckiest woman in America. She did not cope with it well, and it would be strange if she had. Janet, by the accounts of that period, began drinking and began using pills to manage the pressure of a marriage that was privately disintegrating and a public image that demanded she pretend it wasn't. The two of them were, by the end of the decade, two beautiful, famous, wealthy people, both self-medicating, both performing happiness they no longer felt, both trapped inside a fairy tale that had become a prison neither of them could admit they were in, because admitting it would have detonated the most valuable asset either of their studios had. Their daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, born in 1958, would later describe the reality of that home with a bluntness that no fan magazine of the era could have survived printing. She said that her parents hated each other. She said, more than once and in more than one venue, that she had been what she called a save-the-marriage baby, meaning she had been conceived specifically as an attempt to repair a relationship that was already failing. Think about what it means to be told, as an adult, that your own existence was a last-ditch effort to fix something broken, and that it did not work. Jamie Lee Curtis has spoken about this with remarkable honesty over the years, and what she describes is not a fairy tale at all. It is two people who could not stand each other, staying together long past the point of love, for the cameras and the careers and the child they hoped might save them. The child did not save them. Children never do, because the problems were never the kind a child could touch. Tony Curtis's problems had started in a tailor shop in the Bronx, 20 years before Janet Leigh ever met him, and no amount of love, no beautiful home, no adoring public, no second daughter, could reach the boy inside the man who had decided, at 12 years old in a morgue, that the only safe thing to do was to never fully belong to anyone again. By 1960, the marriage was effectively over in every way except the legal one and the public one. They were still Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh, America's dream couple on the surface. Underneath, there was almost nothing left. All it needed was a reason to end, a final push, something, or someone, to make Tony Curtis finally walk away from the fairy tale he had never believed in anyway. In 1961, he flew to Argentina to make a sweeping historical epic called Taras Bulba, and waiting for him on that production was a 17-year-old girl who was about to become the reason the whole world learned that the most beautiful marriage in Hollywood had been a lie for years. By the time Tony Curtis boarded the plane to Argentina in 1961, he and Janet Leigh had already been living as strangers who happened to share a house. Curtis himself would later say that he and Janet were legally separated for over a year before he ever went to make Taras Bulba, which, if true, means the marriage was functionally dead well before the affair that gets blamed for killing it. That detail matters because the story the public eventually got, and the story that still gets told, is that a 17-year-old girl destroyed a perfect marriage. The truth is that the marriage had been destroying itself for the better part of a decade, and the girl was simply what Curtis found on the other side of a door he had already walked through. The last years had been a slow grind of everything described so far, intensifying. The affairs, the drugs, the jealousy about Sinatra, and about other men who did not, as far as anyone can tell, ever actually exist as threats. Janet's own drinking and pill use, escalating in response to a home life that had become unbearable. Two people who, in their daughter's later blunt words, hated each other, still technically married, still occasionally photographed together, still maintaining for the studios and the magazines the fiction that had made them both rich and famous. They kept working, together and apart, because working was easier than being home. Janet had, in 1960, given one of the defining performances of her career in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, playing Marion Crane, the woman murdered in the shower in what is still one of the most famous scenes in the history of film. She was, at that exact moment, at the peak of her professional life, more respected and more visible than she had ever been. The irony is savage. The most successful year of Janet Leigh's career was also the year her marriage entered its final collapse. She was being celebrated by the entire world as one of the finest actresses alive, and she was going home to a marriage that had turned to ash. Tony's career was riding high too. Some Like It Hot had made him bigger than ever. He was one of the most sought-after leading men in Hollywood, commanding major roles in major pictures. On paper, both of them had everything. In practice, they had 2 daughters, a mountain of shared fame, and nothing left between them but resentment and exhaustion. Jamie Lee, the younger daughter, was 2 or 3 years old during this final stretch. She would grow up knowing almost nothing of the fairy tale, because by the time she was old enough to form memories, the fairy tale was already over. What she absorbed instead was the aftermath: 2 famous parents who had split, a father who was increasingly absent and increasingly consumed by his addictions, a mother holding herself together with a grace that cost her enormously. Jamie Lee's later candor about all of this, her willingness to say plainly that she was a save-the-marriage baby and that her parents despised each other, is part of why we know the real story at all. She refused, as an adult, to protect the myth. She told the truth about what it had actually been like. And the truth was that there had been no fairy tale in that house for as long as she could remember. So when the plane took off for Argentina, Tony Curtis was not a happily married man about to be tempted into ruin. He was a man whose marriage was already a corpse, flying to a remote film location half a world away from the wife he could no longer stand, and the home that had become a source of nothing but tension, with a drug habit riding along in his luggage, and an insecurity in his chest that no amount of success had ever been able to fill. He was, in other words, in exactly the state of a man about to do something reckless, away from home, away from scrutiny, miserable, famous, 36 years old and certain, in the deepest part of himself, that real love was a lie, because the only love he'd ever fully trusted was the kind that hurt you. Taras Bulba was a sprawling historical epic based on a Russian novel, shot on location in the vast open country of northern Argentina, with a cast that included Yul Brynner and a huge international production built around thousands of extras and enormous battle sequences. Productions like that, shot far from home over many months, are notorious for what they do to the people trapped inside them, the isolation, the boredom between setups, the intensity of the shared experience, the way the outside world stops feeling real. Location romances are a Hollywood cliché precisely because the conditions manufacture them so reliably. And cast in the film, as the young woman Tony Curtis's character falls in love with, was an actress named Christine Kaufmann. She was a German-Austrian teenager who had been working since she was a small child and had already won a Golden Globe for a film called Town Without Pity. She was strikingly beautiful, talented, and, at the time the two of them met on that production, 17 years old. Tony Curtis was 37. What happened between them in Argentina would end his marriage for good, humiliate his wife on a scale that made international headlines, and follow all three of them for the rest of their lives. And Janet Leigh, back in Los Angeles, working, raising two daughters, holding the pieces together, had no idea any of it was coming. She would find out the way she found out everything about the end of her marriage. Suddenly, publicly, and from a piece of paper. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The affair in Argentina was not subtle, and it was not brief. Tony Curtis and Christine Kaufmann fell into a relationship on the set of Taras Bulba, and by the accounts of people on that production, it was serious almost immediately. This was not a fling that Curtis intended to hide and move past. He had, whether he admitted it to himself yet or not, found the exit he had been looking for from a marriage that had been dead for years, and the exit had a face and a name, and was 17 years old. The production itself was a grind. It ran long, over budget and over schedule, shooting in the remote country of northern Argentina for months. Janet Leigh actually visited the set at one point, which is one of the small, brutal details of the whole story. She came to Salta to see her husband while he was in the middle of falling in love with his teenage co-star, and there are photographs of her there, in the hills, apparently unaware of what was happening around her. The marriage was already effectively over by then, but the affair was a new and specific wound, and she seems not to have known yet how deep it went. Then the production ended, everyone went home, and Tony Curtis made his decision. He filed for divorce. The way Janet Leigh learned about it is the detail that has made this story endure for 60 years, because it is almost unbelievably cruel in its timing. She was working. She was filming The Manchurian Candidate, the John Frankenheimer political thriller that would become one of the most acclaimed films of the decade. And according to her own account, she was handed the divorce papers on that set, at work, shortly before she had to shoot her scene, which happened to be the famous train sequence opposite Frank Sinatra. Sit with the layers of that for a moment. The husband, who had spent years torturing her with baseless suspicions that she was having an affair with Frank Sinatra, chose to serve her divorce papers so that she received them minutes before she had to perform a romantic scene with Frank Sinatra. Whether Curtis engineered that timing, or it was simply the way the paperwork fell, is impossible to know. Either way, Janet Leigh had to take an envelope containing the end of her 11-year marriage, absorb it, and then walk onto a soundstage and act. And then the reason became public, and the public reason was worse than the divorce itself. Because it was not just that Tony Curtis was leaving her, it was who he was leaving her for. Janet Leigh, 35 years old, one of the most beautiful and celebrated actresses in the world, fresh from Psycho and now making the Manchurian Candidate, was being traded for a 17-year-old. The papers ran it exactly that way. The whole world learned, at the same moment, that the dream marriage had ended and that the dream husband had left the dream wife for a teenager. Janet said, in later years, that the deepest wound was the humiliation, not simply losing the marriage, which had been miserable for a long time, but the specific public shame of being left, at the height of her fame and beauty, for a girl young enough to be her own daughter. There is a particular cruelty in that kind of ending, the sense that no matter what you achieved, no matter how the world celebrated you, your husband looked at all of it and decided a 17-year-old was worth more. She was devastated by it, and she was humiliated by it, and she had to endure both while the entire world watched and while she continued, professionally, to show up and work. The divorce was pushed through quickly. To end it fast and cleanly, it was finalized in Mexico in 1962. 11 years of marriage, 2 daughters, a decade as the most admired couple in Hollywood, dissolved in a rushed foreign proceeding designed mainly to get it over with. And then Tony Curtis did the thing that removed any remaining doubt about what the divorce had really been about. He did not wait. He did not take time to be alone, to reflect, to steady himself. In 1963, the year after the divorce from Janet was finalized, he married Christine Kaufmann. She was 18 by then. He was 38. The 20-year gap that had scandalized the world was now a legal marriage. The fairy tale, the one the fan magazines had sold to America for over a decade, was not just over. It had been publicly revealed as a fiction, and the man at the center of it had walked out of it and directly into the arms of a teenager without so much as a pause. Janet Leigh was left standing in the wreckage, holding 2 daughters and the shattered remains of the most photographed marriage in Hollywood, with the whole world watching to see how she would handle it. The way she handled it is the reason that, 60 years later, it is Janet Leigh people admire in this story, and not the man who left her. Janet Leigh could have burned him down. She had every reason to, and she had the platform to do it. She was a major star. The press was desperate for her side of the story. The public was overwhelmingly sympathetic to her already, and one bitter interview, one wounded tell-all, would have been eagerly printed and widely believed. Tony Curtis had humiliated her on an international scale. Nobody would have blamed her for hitting back. She never did. For the rest of her life, Janet Leigh refused to badmouth Tony Curtis in public. She did not trash him in interviews. She did not use her daughters as weapons. She did not feed the press the ugly details she certainly possessed after 11 years inside that marriage. When she spoke of him at all, she spoke with a restraint that bordered on generosity, given what he had done. This was not because she felt no anger. She had been devastated and humiliated, and she said so. It was a choice, a deliberate and sustained act of grace, and it is the single biggest reason that history has been kind to Janet Leigh and much harder on Tony Curtis. She took the high road and stayed on it for 40 years. It cost her something to do that, and one of the costs came through her own children. Curtis, for his part, was less restrained. He offered his own explanations for why the marriage had failed, and they tended to shift blame onto Janet. He described her as bossy and made a comparison that reveals more about him than about her. He said she was bossy like his mother, always correcting his behavior in public. That is an extraordinary thing to say, because it accidentally tells the truth. The problem was never that Janet Leigh resembled his mother. The problem was that Tony Curtis could not be loved by any woman without eventually experiencing her as the mother who had beaten him and fleeing. Janet's supposed crime, correcting him in public, is the complaint of a man who never healed the wound that made ordinary intimacy feel like attack. Their older daughter, Kelly, as a teenager, chose to go live with her father rather than her mother. For Janet, who had held everything together, who had taken the high road, who had protected the family's dignity at real personal cost, this must have been a quiet devastation. And still, she reportedly tried to speak about even that in positive terms. She would not let herself become bitter in public, even when her own child chose the parent who had blown up the family. Tony Curtis's own life, meanwhile, became a long demonstration of the pattern that had ended his first marriage, repeating over and over. The marriage to Christine Kaufmann, the 17-year-old he had left Janet for, the relationship that had caused an international scandal and destroyed the most famous marriage in Hollywood, did not last. They had 2 daughters together, Alexandra and Allegra, and then, in 1968, just 5 years after the wedding, they divorced. The great love worth demolishing everything for had lasted half a decade. He married again that same year, to a model named Leslie Allen. That marriage produced 2 sons and lasted until 1982, longer than most, before it too ended in divorce. Then he married Andrea Savio in 1984, divorced in 1992. Then Lisa Deutsch in 1993, divorced in 1994, barely a year. Then, finally, Jill Vandenberg in 1998, a woman more than 40 years younger than him, who remained his wife until his death. 6 marriages. The pattern never really changed, because the wound underneath it never healed. Tony Curtis kept looking for the thing that would finally make him feel safe and loved, and kept fleeing it the moment he found it, because being loved was the one thing the boy from the tailor shop had never learned how to survive. The drug addiction that had haunted the Janet Leigh years deepened into a genuine crisis. By the 1970s and into the 1980s, Curtis was consumed by cocaine and alcohol, his career in serious decline, his reputation as a serious actor eroded by years of erratic behavior and diminishing roles. He eventually got sober, checking into the Betty Ford Center in the 1980s, and he lived the rest of his life clean, but the addiction had taken a heavy toll on his body, his work, and his relationships. And then came the loss that echoed the one that had defined his childhood. Tony Curtis had a son, Nicholas, from his marriage to Leslie Allen. In 1994, Nicholas died of a heroin overdose. He was 23 years old. Consider the terrible symmetry of it. Tony Curtis, at 12, had to identify the body of his younger brother Julius, killed by a truck, and had kept the boy's cap and schoolbooks for the rest of his life, because that was all that was left. Now, decades later, as an old man, he lost his own son to addiction, the same disease that had nearly destroyed his own life. The boy who had learned in a morgue that the people you love get taken from you had that lesson confirmed one final, unbearable time. He never fully recovered from Nicholas's death. Friends said it broke something in him that had already been badly broken for a very long time. By the 2000s, Tony Curtis was an old man in Nevada, his health failing, his glory decades behind him, and in the last chapter of his life, something unexpected happened. The manufactured movie star, Tony Curtis, the name Universal had bolted onto him in 1948, began to give way, at the very end, to the person underneath. Bernard Schwartz was coming home. In the last years of his life, Tony Curtis went looking for the boy the studio had erased. He had spent 6 decades as the invention Universal had built, the smooth leading man with the fixed accent, and the fixed name, and the fixed teeth. And as an old man, he turned back toward the thing underneath the invention, which was a poor Jewish kid from a Hungarian immigrant family in the Bronx, named Bernard Schwartz. He embraced his Jewish heritage openly and deliberately. He founded the Emmanuel Foundation for Hungarian Culture, named after his father, dedicated to restoring the synagogues and the roughly 1,300 Jewish cemeteries in Hungary that had been devastated by the Holocaust. He helped finance the rebuilding of the Great Synagogue in Budapest, the largest synagogue in Europe. He dedicated the work to the 600,000 Hungarian Jews murdered in the Holocaust, the community his own parents had escaped before he was born. The movie star spent his final energy honoring the world his family had come from, the world that had made Bernard Schwartz before Hollywood unmade him. At the end, as one tribute put it, Tony Curtis became, once again, Bernard Schwartz. He also, remarkably, made a kind of peace with Janet Leigh before the end. The two of them had been divorced for over 40 years by the 2000s. Time and their shared daughters had worn the sharpest edges off the wound. They were, in the last stretch, on cordial terms, connected permanently by Kelly and Jamie Lee and by the grandchildren, able to be in the same rooms, able to speak. It was not a reconciliation of the marriage. It was something quieter and, given how it had ended, almost surprising. Two old people who had once been the most beautiful couple in the world and who had caused each other enormous pain, arriving at the far side of it into something like calm. Janet Leigh died first. She passed away on October 3, 2004, at 77, after a battle with vasculitis. She had lived a full life after Tony. She had remarried to the stockbroker Robert Brandt in 1962, right after the divorce. And that marriage lasted until her death, more than 4 decades, the stable and loving partnership that her fairy tale first marriage had never actually been. She had continued acting, she had written books, she had raised 2 daughters who adored her, and she had kept, to the very end, the grace she had chosen in 1962, never once publicly tearing down the man who had humiliated her before the world. When she died, she was remembered not as the woman Tony Curtis left for a teenager, but as one of the great screen actresses of her era, and as a person of rare dignity. Tony Curtis outlived her by 6 years. He died on September 29, 2010, at 85, of cardiac arrest at his home in Nevada. His widow, Jill Vandenberg, the 6th wife, more than 40 years younger than him, was with him. He was buried in Las Vegas. And it fell to their daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, the Save the Marriage baby, the child who had been conceived to fix something that could not be fixed, to hold the truth of both her parents. She has never pretended the marriage was a fairy tale. She has said, plainly and repeatedly, that her parents hated each other, that she was born to save a marriage that was already lost, that the glossy magazine version was a fiction. But she has also spoken about her father with a hard-won compassion that seems to come from understanding where he actually came from. She has been open about his addiction, about his failures, about the son he lost. And she became, herself, one of the most successful and respected actresses of her generation, and one of the most candid public figures in Hollywood about addiction and family dysfunction, precisely because she refused to keep the secrets her parents' era had been built on keeping. Look at the whole shape of it. A boy in a Bronx tailor shop, beaten by a schizophrenic mother, given away to the state for a month because his parents couldn't feed him, standing in a morgue at 12 to identify his dead brother, learning before he was 10 that the only person who would ever protect him was himself. A boy who was handed a new name and a new face and turned into the most desired man in America, and who spent the rest of his life unable to accept love from anyone, because the first love he ever knew had taught him that love and harm came from the same hands. He married the kindest woman in Hollywood and could not bear it. He humiliated her before the world and left her for a teenager, and could not make that last either. He married 6 times looking for something he had lost before he was old enough to name it. He buried a son to the same disease that nearly killed him. And at the very end, he stopped being Tony Curtis and went home, in his heart, to the family and the faith and the little boy the studio had erased. The title says Janet Leigh's marriage ended when she found out the truth, and it did. But the truth she found out that day on the set was only the small truth, the affair, the teenager, the divorce papers. The bigger truth took much longer to come out, and it was this. Tony Curtis had never really been capable of staying. The tailor shop had made sure of that, decades before Janet Leigh ever smiled at him at a party, and made a broken man briefly believe in fairy tales. She got the best of him anyway. She got the years when he still wanted to believe. And she was the one who walked away with her dignity, while the most handsome man in the world spent the next 50 years running from everyone who ever tried to love him. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.